This is a story by Scare in a Box called Grave Zero from the subreddit Short Stories. The modern weapon blacksmith is an artist of death. Jeremiah's father was one, as was his grandfather, as was his grandfather's father and grandfather, and so on. The older generations made weapons in pots. His grandfather perfected bayonets. His father helped out at a bullet factory, and Jeremiah went back to crafting weapons. Many people were interested in his artistry. There was something intangible about tools meant for blood being turned into ornaments and sculptures. Jeremiah had the care to make them sharp, to make them capable of being used for blood, like their ancestors. Thus, he was an artist of death. That aside, the profession brought good money. Buyers were few, but blacksmiths were even fewer, and the people his business attracted understood the value of what he did, and they paid accordingly. Right now, however, he was dying. Not literally, but of stress. He pumped the bellows of the furnace to continue preparing a sword while the blade of a battle axe cooled. It was hell managing two projects like this at once, but both clients were willing to pay extra to get their product earlier, and so there he was, sweating like a dog in the red glow of the fire. This was to be a longsword with a hilt of black-colored bronze and dual alloy blade. Edges had to be hard and sharp, while the spine needed to be softer for flexibility. A rigid sword is a poor man's choice. Bendable swords last long, and they last well. This sword was to have specific rose and thorn pattern engraved on its blade and hilt to give the effect of roots growing out from the point of the blade, blooming into roses on the hilt. It was a beautiful sword, though it pained Jeremiah that it would only be used as a mantelpiece. He recognized it was macabre how happier he'd be if this weapon were being used for actual warfare. But most art pieces had no utility. You couldn't use books as tools or paintings as carpets. Art existed for art's sake. He just had come to the terms of the fact that his family's art was like any other now. So, he put steel in the furnace, worked on the axe as it melted. He used a blacksmith's flatter hammer to smooth out the axe blade's surface, fix irregularities, then he got the set hammer to make the curved edges of the axe more pronounced. He drenched the axe in cold water, studied it, found 3 defects with the blade. Back in the furnace it went. Jeremiah would do this as many times as needed until the blade came out perfect. He took the sword's blade's metal out of the furnace, poured it over the mold he had prepared earlier. A while later, he grabbed it with the thick tongs and set metal over anvil and used a straight peen hammer to spread the material and roughly sketch the sword's straight edges. Then he used the ball peen hammer to draw out the long sword shape better than his mold could. It was after spending the better part of an hour working that blade, drenching it in water, inspecting the results, and setting it to dry before putting it back into the furnace that he heard the bell of the shop's door open. A client had come in. "I'll be there in a minute," he said. He hurried up, taking his gloves and apron off, wiping the sweat from his forehead, hoping the client wasn't a kid. He hated it when kids entered his shop just because it was cool. They always grabbed the exposed swords despite the many big signs telling them not to do so. Yet, when he got to the front of the shop, the door was already closing. It closed with a small cling as the bell above the door rang again. He shrugged. Most customers never end up buying anything anyway. Most couldn't afford it. He turned to go back to the forge and... There's a large wooden box in the corner of the counter. It had a note by its side. It was written in Gothic script, but thankfully it was in English. "Your work has caught my attention a long time ago. It's nigh time I requested a very special kind of weapon, a scythe. Inside this box is half of what I'm willing to pay. I trust it is more than enough for the request inside. You may also find the blueprint for what I'm envisioning as well as the delivery address. I trust you'll be able to make this work. Thank you. I'll be near until you have it ready." Jeremiah whistled. Scythes were hard. Curved swords were already tricky enough to get the metal well distributed. A scythe had an even smaller joint. It would be tricky. He had never crafted one, but the right amount of attention he could make it work. So he started counting the money in between breaks for forging the sword and bettering the axe. Heart thundering each time he went back into the accounting. The upfront money was 4 times as much as he'd asked for his best works. This was an insurmountable payment, the likes of which his blacksmith ancestors had never seen. And this was a challenge. It had to be. God, he never felt so alive, so gloriously alive. His father and grandfather had trained him for this moment. He had this more than covered. Tomorrow morning, he'd get up and get started on making a battle scythe. Scythes had two main parts, the snath, or the handle, and the blade. The mystery client had requested a strange material for the snath, obsidian, pure, dark obsidian. Getting obsidian was hard, and he wasn't used to working with stone, but he'd have to manage. He called a guy who knew a guy who knew a guy, and after a hefty payment, he was told he'd get his block of obsidian. This would be a masterwork, so every penny would be worth it. Hell, he was invested more for the sake of his art than the final payment. He also called his local steel mill to get a batch of high-carbon steel. While not great for swords and other large weapons, the steel was great for holding an edge. Scythes are thin objects, mostly made of edge. This was the right choice. While waiting for everything to arrive, he gave the finishing touches to the axe and continued working on the sword. He was nearly over with them when the block of obsidian was delivered to his store. He called another friend of his to give him a few tips on how to work with the obsidian. The problem was that obsidian is basically glass, a natural volcanic glass. It was brittle material, so carving out a curved shape would be tricky. He had to be okay with a certain degree of roughness. His friend had more surprised that he had even money to buy an entire block of it. It was usually distributed in small chunks because intact blocks, apart from hard to find, were expensive to ship. So he got started, switching from working the snath to taking care of the blade. He got the steel in the furnace, turned on the ventilators, and his real work began. Days blended into night, and nights blended into weeks. His sole soundtrack, the ring of the metal against the anvil. His sole exercise, the rise of the hammer and their descent over the iron. This was his domain. This was his life. Slowly, the blade grew thin, curved. After each careful tapering of heated metal, Jeremiah would check the measurements. Everything had to be perfect. Everything had to be right by the millimeter. The blade had to be deadly thin and strong for centuries. It had to be perfectly tempered and perfectly hardened. The snath was altogether a different experience. He was in uncharted territory. It was a good thing he'd bought such a large chunk of obsidian. Otherwise, he'd have wasted it all on failed attempts. Obsidian was so jagged, so brittle. He kept either cracking the snath outright or making it too thick or too thin in certain places. He had to get the perfect handle, and then he had to create somehow the perfect cavity to fix the tang, the part of the blade shaped like a hook that would connect the blade to the handle. Constant switching of tasks and weighing different choices made weeks roll by without his notice. Jeremiah skipped meals, then had too many meals, skipped naps, slept odd hours, but none of that mattered. He had a goal, and he'd only be able to rest once his goal was achieved. As soon as he finished carving the perfect snath, the door opened and closed in a span of a few seconds. He found another note on the counter. The note has the same lettering as the scythe's note. I'm pleased with your work. I'll personally pick the weapon up 7 days from now. I need it to be perfect as much as you do, and I'm counting on you. We all are. This note was weirder than previous ones, but who was he to judge? Most of his clients were a little eccentric. Who wanted a sword in this day and age? So Jeremiah went back to the trance to craft a flawless weapon, turning his attention to making a reliable, sturdy tang. This part was by far the trickiest. Everything had to be impeccable. Everything had to fit like clockwork. Anything else, and he wouldn't be satisfied. So the week went by, blindingly fast, days blending together to the point where his nights were spent dreaming about the scythe in strange, deep tombs. Jeremiah spent the last day sitting in silence in front of his store, hoping each passerby's shadow was his client. It wasn't until the sky was crimson and purple, sick with dusk, that the door opened at last. A tall woman in dark flowing clothes entered. It was misty outside. It seemed like she materialized herself out of it, mist made into substance on her command, shaped into whom Jeremiah saw now. Good evening, he said, reticent, then held his breath. Though she seemed to be made of flesh, her countenance was not. It was made of stone, eyes closed like a sleeping statue. She was beautiful and terrifying, in all her humanness and otherworldliness. Hello, Jeremiah. Her voice was like stone rasping on stone, yet it was not unpleasant to the ear. It was rough but comfortable, yet her mouth didn't move as she spoke. Is it ready? This was a statement, not a question. She was speaking directly into his mind somehow. A thought crept up on him, and his heart beat so strongly his chest hurt. His ears rang. He could only nod. It is, he croaked. Her clothes, the weapon she'd ordered, the mist, the sharp colors of dusk, everything made sense. He knew who his client was, or, at least, who they were pretending to be. I apologize for not introducing myself. I am Death. A bead of sweat rolled down the side of his temples. Had it come for him so early? It was a surprise she existed, but that he could deal with. She was there to take him. That had to be it. Why? He hadn't done anything to deserve this. Rarely anyone does, she said, as if reading his thoughts. She probably was. Could I see it? Huh? He's confused, dazed, entranced by the smoke-like garments, by the smooth stone her face and flesh of her arms. The scythe. I would like to see it. He moved, but not of his own accord. He's a puppet. The strings unseen. Not invisible, but out of his reach. He went into the back rooms and got the scythe. Wrapped in cloth, like an offering for the gods it was. Here. With nimble hands she unfolded the scythe, gripped it. The moment her hands touched it, the scythe shone impossibly black, ringing like a grave bell. The blade rang as well, smoothly, making a perfect octave with the other sound. Then, silence. It is perfect, she said. The obsidian snath was carved with a pattern of thorns and petals, giving way to roots that went around the gilded blade. It was a perfect weapon. It was a perfect testament to his art. And it would kill him. I apologize once again, she continued, and he somehow knew her next words. I did not come only for the scythe. I came for you, Jeremiah. Your time has come. He stepped away from the counter. This is a joke, right? A prank? Death stayed still, the scythe starting to ring softly, almost like a distant whistle. That face, those clothes, the mist. It truly was Death. No, he was being pranked. There had to be a logical explanation for all this. There had to. Then he froze. The clock above the door had stopped. He could have sworn he saw it ticking a moment ago. No, this can't be happening. Jeremiah ran to the back rooms, to his workshop, to the forge. There he'd be safe. There he'd be doomed. He was doomed. The workshop was eerily silent. He opened the furnace, saw the fire on, but still, as if it was frozen flame, as if it was a warm picture of a fireplace. And Death was behind him. I do not wish to see you suffering. Death can be a relief. Change does not have to be painful. I apologize. Why? He begged. I'm healthy. She pointed to his chest, then at the furnace. Your quest for traditionalism has pushed you to inhale a lot of harmful substances. Disease was spreading. Had already spread. He fell to his knees, realizing he hadn't had any kids, and that all his family had worked for centuries was going to end. Yet, Death continued, you have made me a great service, the likes of which I have not seen for millennia. She turned to the scythe, spun it in her thin hands. I'm granting you a wish as compensation for your efforts. Jeremiah almost spoke before she added, yet you may not ask for your life back. Your death is certain. You may not delay it any further. You may not freeze time. You may not go back in time. Your place in time and space is not to change. Those are the rules. Jeremiah looked at her, thought of pleading, but those eyes of stone held no mercy. Only retribution. His time was up, but he was allowed one little treat before parting. He could ask for world peace, but why would peace matter if he would not be part of it? You may not ask for your life back, he thought. You may not delay it. Your life back, not delay. Life back, not delay. And just like that, he knew what to do. What could save him? What could permit him to keep his art alive? Every living being began to die the moment it was born. Death a certain point in the future, no matter how far. What if he switched the order? What if instead of dying past his birth, he died before it? I, he said, wish to die towards the past. He was prepared to explain his reasoning. He was prepared for Death to turn him down, to say it was not possible. Yet, he had not broken the terms. He had been fair. Her silence felt like proof of that. Suddenly her mouth parted into a smile, the stone of her face cracking with small plumes of black dust. Very well, she said. Her dress smoked away from her feet and up her legs, curling around her new scythe, fading away like mist in the sun, until she was all gone, that ghostly smile etching its way into the very front of his mind. Jeremiah found another wooden box on the counter of the shop next to the pile of newspapers he'd been meaning to read for weeks. The box was filled with money. He'd gotten his payment. He had kept his life. He smiled in a way not wholly different from death. He woke up the next day with a new shine in his eyes. Yesterday felt like a dream, like a pocket of unreality that lived inside his mind. Perhaps that was the case. He ran his mind through what he thought he had to do, and for some reason kept manically thinking of a scythe. He didn't do scythes. They were tricky, far trickier than swords. Yet he was somehow aware of the process of making one, of the quick gists of the wrist he had to do to get the shape down. After breakfast and getting dressed, he noticed he had left his phone in the shop the day before, so he went straight there, entering through the back of the shop. Everything was laid out like he'd actually made a scythe. The molds, the hammers lying around, a chunk of glass like black stone. Obsidian? Gods, he had to go to the doctor. He nearly stumbled with a spike of anxiety that went through him as he realized that if he had truly made a scythe, then the other aspects of his dream were also true. Death. It's all in your mind, Jeremiah told himself. All in your mind. Yet, when he got to his phone, he had 2 messages from 2 separate friends telling him he looked ill in the last photo he'd posted on his blacksmithing blog, asking him if he was okay. He opened the blog, and it was true. His eyes were somewhat sunken, his cheeks harsher. He appeared plainly sick. That didn't scare him. Scrolling up his last post, however, did. He looked even worse than the previous post, even worse than the one before that, and so much worse than the one before that. He scrolled up again. He didn't appear in the photo. The photo was just an empty weapon store, but that photo had previously included him. He didn't appear in any of the previous blog posts. There was no trace of him. He ran to the bathroom, checked himself in the mirror. He was still there. He pinched himself on the arm, on the neck, on the cheeks. He was still there, goddammit. He sped back home, went straight for the box in the attic that held his childhood photo albums. He appeared in none. None. There were pictures of his father playing with empty air where he had been, pictures of his mother nursing a bunch of rags and blankets, a baby bottle floating, nothing holding it. There was a picture of him holding the first knife he forged, except the knife was floating too. There was a picture of his first day playing soccer, except he was missing from that team photo. There was his graduation day showing an empty stage. He touched his face, still there. He scrolled through his phone's gallery, seeing the same picture he had put up on his page. It was as if he was decaying at an alarming rate, except backwards in time, disappearing from the photos from 3 days ago and never reappearing, as if he had died 3 days ago, as if he was dying backwards. I wish to die towards the past, he had told Death. She had complied. What happened now? Was he immortal? Would anyone even remember him? If photos of him 3 days prior were gone now, then what about his friends' memories? His close family were dead. He still had friends. God, he had clients. He had an enormous list of weapons to craft. He had a year-long waiting list. What would he do? He called one of his friends who texted him, and as soon as he picked up, Jeremiah asked, "How did you meet me? Do you remember?" "What? Dude, are you okay?" "Just answer, please. I think it was..." "Huh. That's strange. I can't seem to recall." 5 days, Jeremiah said. "We went to the pub 5 days ago. We talked about your ex-girlfriend and about another thing. What was that thing?" "We went to the pub?" his friend asked. Jeremiah hung up, heaving, sweat beading on his forehead. He felt dizzy. The world spinning and spinning faster and faster. That bastard Death. She had smiled. She had known the consequence of his wish and had gone with it all the same. He should have died. His father had drilled him on why he should never try to outthink someone older than him, and he had tried to outthink death of all things. What was even older than death? What did his father used to say? Deep breaths, my boy. Deep breaths. Take your problem apart. There's got to be a first step you can take somewhere. Search it, find it, take it. Then repeat until everything's over. If he could live as long as he wanted from now on, all he had to do was recreate his life, find new friends and the like. That was not impossible. He could do this. This would not stop him. If he had infinite time, then he could become the best blacksmith humanity had ever seen. Slightly invigorated and desperate for something to take his mind off all this, Jeremiah went back to his shop. As he went, he felt himself forgetting the pictures he'd just seen. What were they? Who was the child that should have been in the picture? A moment of clarity came, and he realized his memories were fading too. Of course they were. If he died days ago, then the man who remembered his own childhood was also dead. He got to the shop, placed the box full of money still on the counter inside his safe, and glanced at the newspaper on top of the pile of newspapers he'd been meaning to read. The latest was from 4 days ago, and it was his village's weekly newspaper. A small square in the left bottom corner of the cover had the following headline: "Unnamed tomb in St. Catherine's Cemetery baffles local residents." He dove for the newspaper like a hungry beast going for dying prey. The article was short. And all it added to the headline was that no one could say when the tomb had first appeared. Jeremiah combed the newspaper pile and found the previous week's newspaper, which also had an article on the unmarked tomb, yet the article was written as if the journalist had just discovered the tomb. Oh no. Oh no, 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 no. It was supposed to be his tomb. Then it meant no one would ever remember him. As the memory of his identity would vanish, he had died long ago, in the past. Every time someone stumbled on anything that could remind them of Jeremiah, they would forget it and be surprised to find it again. It would mean his immortality was beyond useless. He was immortal, but an invisible blot to everyone else. He got in his car and drove to the cemetery, 5 minutes away from his shop. Sure enough, there was no sign on his tomb. He went straight to the library at full speed, nearly killing himself in 2 near misses with other drivers. He parked in the middle of the street, sprinted up the steps to the library, and went straight to the middle-aged lady at the counter. "Excuse me, I need to see your newspaper records," he blurted out. "The Weekly Licky, most specifically." "Yeah?" She took as long to say that one word as he took for the whole sentence. "Your library card?" "You need your library card for that," he said. "Oh, yes." "My friend is already in the room and he has it," he lied. "Which way is the room again?" "The records are in the basement," she said. "Come with me. I'll take you there. I just need to check the card. No need for you to run upstairs and make a ruckus." She took so long to talk it was unnerving him. "Basement? Thanks," and he was off. He went down the old musty steps and into the dusty darkness of the basement. He wasted no time searching for the switch and used his phone's flashlight instead. He found the boxes containing the local newspaper and rummaged through them, paying no heed to the warnings to take care of the old paper. The tomb kept on being rediscovered. The older the newspaper was, the older the tomb seemed. The oldest edition there was 70 years old, and the yellow photo showed a tomb taken by vines and creepers, the stone chipped and cracked like a 70-year-old tomb. It made perfect, terrifying sense. He died towards the past, thus his tomb got older the further back in time it was. How the hell was he getting out of this mess? By dying? By striking a deal? How could he find death again? How did he make her come to him? How? He went to the first floor of the library and found a book he was searching for, one he'd stumbled across in his teens because of his history project. It was a book written in the late 1800s by the founders of the town about the town itself. Jeremiah searched the index of the books and found what he was searching for, a chapter named The Tomb. In it was a discolored picture of his tomb and a hypothesis of how that tomb was already there. The stone was extremely weathered, barely standing, but there's no doubt about it. It was his tomb, his grave, grave zero. He was doomed. Eternal life without sharing with anyone was not a life. It was just eternal survival. He left the library and went home to sleep, defeated and lost. In the dream, he's in a field on top of a hill. The surrounding hills look familiar, and Jeremiah seems he's in a town's cemetery. For him is an unmarked tomb, the shape well familiar to him. It's his tomb, his resting place. Yet now there's a door of stone in front of it. He kneels and pries it open. It opens easily, as if made by paper. Stairs of ancient stone descended into darkness, curling into an ever-infinite destination. Jeremiah has nowhere to go. No time to live any longer. He died and presently lives. He knows that it's not right. It's time to fix his mistakes. So he takes the first step, descends, sees the stairwell is not as dark as he thought. Though the sky is now a pinprick of light above him, there's another source of light further down. The level below has a door of stone as well. He opens it and sees a blue sky, the same hills, but a different fauna? There are plants he's never seen, scents he's never smelled, and animals he's never seen. He sees a gigantic bison, a saber-tooth, and a furry elephant, a mammoth. He should be surprised, awed even, but he's numb. He's tired, and he's out of time. He looks at himself in a puddle and sees a different version of himself. He's thinner, his hairline not as receded, his beard shorter, spottier, he's younger. He returns to the staircase, goes down another level, finds another door. He steps out and is greeted by a dark sky, yet it's still day. The sun's a red spot in the darkened sky. Darkened? Darkened by what? The smell of something burning hits him, and he notices flakes of ash falling from the sky. There are only a few animals around, flying reptiles and a few rodents. Dinosaurs, mice. There's a piece of ice by the tomb, and he looks at himself in it. His face lacks any facial hair whatsoever. Pimples line his cheeks and forehead, and his hair is long. He does not recognize his reflection. All he knows is that the memory of what his eyes see is dead, long dead. The cold air and smell of fire and decay are too much for him, and thus down he goes. There's another door down below. The handle seems higher, but that is because he's shorter. He opens it and sees a gigantic feathered beast with sharp teeth as big as a human head coming straight at him. He slams the door closed. He looks at his hands and sees that they're the hands of a child. He does not know what these hands have felt, doesn't remember. Must have been someone else. There are still stairs going down yet another floor. As he descends, his legs wobble, grow weak and fat, until he's forced to slow down to a crawl, meaty limbs struggling to hold him as he climbs down the steps. Steps are nearly as tall as him now. This door has no handle. All he has to do is push. He crawls his baby body like a sack of liquid, impossible to move in the way he wants. Beyond the door is lightning and dark clouds of sulfur and acid. There's no life. There's nothing but primitive chaos. The door closes. He cannot go outside. He must not go back. The only way is down. The last flight of stairs is painful. His body is too fresh, too naked and fragile for the steps. Nonetheless, he makes his way down the steps now taller than him, like mountains. Like planets, he has to make his way across. The floor he reaches is the last one. There's no stairs anymore. There's only ground and a door frame without a door. Beyond it is darkness, pure darkness, not made of the absence of light, but the absence of everything. Pure nullification, pure nothingness, except for the slight outline of a scythe growing in the fabric of the universe, roots stretching across the emptiness. So familiar. This is it. This is what he's been searching for. This is what he needs. He knows nothing else, remembers nothing else. He is now the blankest of slates. He is nothing. He pushes his body forwards with his arms in one last breath, crawling into the final oblivion. That was Grave Zero by Scare in a Box from the Short Stories subreddit. Thank you so much for listening. Hope to see you in the next one.